So we're out at the farm today. This is an organic dairy farm near the Great Lakes in Wisconsin, and they use a composting bedding back barn, so the cows are kept in the barn over winter and through early spring until they can be let out in the fields. And the way that the bedding pack barn works is that every day or every other day they come out and apply carbon, because of course the manure from the cows is really rich in nitrogen, so you need to add in carbon if you want to get that to compost. And that's carbon in the form of dried corn stalks or sawdust or wood chips or straw or whatever they've got. And that's tined in with a small tractor, 12 to 18 inches, like I said, every day or every other day. And that bedding pack then, that mixture of brown carbon and the manure from the cows, starts to heat, starts to compost, and actually provides a relatively clean medium for the cows to lay down on and chew their cud and so on. So it keeps the cows warm and keeps them clean over winter. Then in spring, that bedding pack material is taken out and placed into windrows, and they're currently actively turning it with a windrow turner or a compost turner. And the compost actually, relatively speaking, turns out well. It breaks down well, and after it goes through heating and turning and so on, it ends up with a nice fungal or earthy smell to it. Having said that, there are issues with compost in terms of getting out there and getting the carbon or brown material worked in on a regular basis. And when that isn't done, then it tends to run higher in nitrogen. Also, the material tends to be on the wetter side. You know, we're shooting for, ideally when you're composting, you want about a 60% moisture content. It tends to be wetter. And so one of the questions was, is there a composting method that can deal with those issues? As well as the fact that when you have a windrow and you're actively turning a windrow, that compost tends to be much more bacterial in nature, because of course we know that when you work soils or you turn compost, it breaks up any fungal hyphae that are trying to establish. So hyphae are the roots that the fungi put out. And it breaks them up, and it prevents the fungal hyphae from ever getting a really substantive hold. And it's the fungal hyphae that researchers and farmers are finding out is really critical in terms of the soil health. It's the fungal hyphae that allow the plants to communicate with all the other microbial community and direct the whole symphony going on there to the advantage of the plant. So the question arose is, is there another composting method that doesn't require as much time, labor, diesel fuel? You know, it's somewhat expensive to turn the piles. Is there another method that doesn't require that? And as a consequence, we're looking at doing two different types of methods. One is called an aerated static pile, and I'll show you that in just a second here, a bit of that in just a second here, what we're doing, as well as and that's aerated, so that's with air, so that's an aerobic composting method, as well as an anaerobic, meaning devoid of oxygen method, and that's using the Gerry Gillespie method. So let me go ahead and run this video here a bit, and so you can see the material that we're using. So over on the left here, we have scrapings out of that alleyway in the composting bedding pack, so that's almost straight manure. But on the right here, we've got a pile of, I'll call it aged, but it's really just bedding pack material that's about 6 months old. So I'll let the video run here, and you can see a little bit about what that looks like. So on the top, we've actually put a small amount of fresh barn scrapings to just make sure that the pile, we've got an active batch of microbes to make sure the pile does heat, because sometimes it's hard to get the pile to start to heat again, to get that microbial community going when we're turning. So we felt like we should add a little bit of fresh manure on top of this. Again, I'm calling it aged manure, but it's just composting bedding bag material that's about 6 months old. And like I said, the carbon to nitrogen ratio tends to be relatively low. In other words, too much nitrogen in general. And we really want a 31 or even 40 to 1 carbon to nitrogen ratio is what we decided we should do. So as a result, we decided, we did some math, and that's a carbon to nitrogen ratio on a weight basis. Did some math and decided to add in some wood chips. It's actually wood chips and leaves and needles and so on from a local tree service. And you can see here in a second, I'm just actually trying to show you a little bit of what this composting bedding pack material looks like. But further down the row here, again, that's the fresh manure. You can see here that's bedding pack material, so you can see some straw mixed in there. And further down the road are the wood chips and, like I said, ground up leaves and needles from a local tree service. So we're adding that onto the pile too. And then we're going to turn all of that to get our carbon to nitrogen ratio, hopefully somewhere around 40 to 1, as well as ensure that the pile's going to fire it up, and that's particularly important for the aerated static pile that we're going to do. So I'm now going to kind of switch gears and talk a little bit about some of the work of David Johnson and his wife, Hu Chun Su. And so we've been looking over his videos and reading some of his material. And one of the charts that I thought was interesting was this one here that shows the fungal to bacterial ratio of various materials. On the far left here, we have 5-month compost, and I believe this is Johnson Su compost. So this is a third, or actually a fourth composting method. I talked about the aerated static pile, the Gerry Gillespie piles. Those are the two that we're going to experiment with this year. And then of course we've got the actively turned compost, and then there's the Johnson Su, what they call Johnson Su compost. And I'll talk about that in other videos, but that is a highly fungal compost. The trouble with it is it takes a long time, and and I'm not sure that we can get all the materials that we're going to need in volume to do that kind of compost. So they use a lot of brown carbon. I guess we can probably get the brown carbon. And the main issue is the amount of time that it takes. You're looking at a year to a year and a half to make this material. And sure, you can plan ahead and get that all figured out and worked into the schedule. But the question that arose was, well, look at the graph or the bar just to the right here. This is just for compost. So granted, it doesn't reach the levels of the Johnson Su in terms of the fungal to bacterial ratio, but it's still very fungal. So anytime you have a pile and you're not turning it, and you've got a high carbon to nitrogen ratio, our question is could we produce compost that was fungal enough and not have to wait a year and a half, and not to mention the fact that the Johnson Su compost that, like I said, year to year and a half to make, has to be kept warm, which is a bit of a problem here in Wisconsin. this particular farm doesn't have a lot of, all its heated space is used, for the parlor and bulk tanks for the milk and so on. So there's heated space in Wisconsin is hard to come by. And if we're doing this in volume, yeah, that's a challenge. So could we make compost using an aerated static pile, which you don't turn it, and I'll talk a bit about more of that in other videos, or Gerry Gillespie, which again, you don't turn it, so it should be much more fungal. Could we make a compost using one of those two methods that would be good enough? Not to mention that with an aerated pile, aerated static pile, you're actually controlling the air. And in the Gerry Gillespie method, you're actually covering the entire pile, so you're capturing any nitrogen and noxious gases and reincorporating that in the compost. So there are other advantages to these composting methods in addition to having the potential to produce highly fungal compost. So I want to go ahead and show you another graph here. Again, this is from Professor David Johnson and his wife, Hu-Chun Su. And that's this one showing efficiency of carbon flow. So plants essentially take the energy from sun and capture the carbon in the air and sequester it either into the soil or into, in the case of these pie charts that are here, brown is root matter, green is green matter, leaves, stalks, and the red is red or orange, depending on, or no, excuse me, the red is the fruit. So the plant takes that carbon and converts it into those various constituents as well as sequestering it into the soil and so on. So currently, according to David Johnson, I believe he said the fungal to bacteria ratio of soils right now is around 11%, I think is what he said, so somewhere in here. So you can see that very small amounts, here it's a little bit higher, of the carbon that the plant sequesters is actually converted into the plant itself, root, green, and fruit material. Although when you push the fungal to bacterial ratio up to 3.68, which he did in his experiments, when you add all these three up, you end up with 56%. So of course you're going to get a much more robust, healthier plant that is able to communicate well with the microbes in the soil because of the fungi and direct the microbes and get the not only the NPK, but the micronutrients that the plant needs and increase yield. So there are a lot of advantages to increasing the fungal to bacteria ratio. So some of the work that's been done, in addition to looking at the fungal bacteria ratio, is the use of compost extract. So I'm kind of switching gears here. We talked a little bit about theory. I'm going to get back to the piles in just a minute here, but if we're able to not only will the compost be applied, spread out onto the fields, but one of the really interesting things is the use of compost extract. So this is based upon the work of Professor Elaine Ingham, Christine Jones, David Johnson and his wife, Hu-Chun Su. And what they found is that if you take this highly fungal compost, if you're able to make highly fungal compost, first of all, and then you extract it, or in other words, flush water through that compost, that when that is dripped into the furrow at the time of planting so that it actually makes contact with the seeds, that what they call biostimulants in this extract actually tricks the seed into thinking, because of course that's water-based and it can get through the shell of the seed, tricks the seed into thinking, wow, I'm being planted into really rich soil. So I'll go ahead and let this run a little bit while I'm talking. So tricks the plant into thinking, I'm being placed into really fungal soil. So as a consequence, the plant starts to produce a lot of exudates, or sugars, to feed what it thinks is a large microbial community. Now, even though that microbial community isn't there in mass, although when you make a highly fungal, very diverse compost, you're actually putting in millions of different types of bacteria and tens of thousands of fungal spores. So when the plant starts to exude those sugars, that microbial community fires up very rapidly, and you get soil building and, like I said, good communication with the microbes in the soil, and a lot of microbes in the soil. And when that's done particularly well, what they're finding is that the use of fertilizer, NPK, as well as the amount of micronutrients in the plant itself, so reduction in the use of NPK or NPK requirements, and increase in micronutrients in the plant itself, as well as being more disease and pest resistance, increases. So there are a lot of benefits, and by using compost extract, dripping a small amount, you're talking about 2 pounds of extract per acre. So, depending on what your equipment does, typically applying 20 gallons per acre, you just do the math on it so that you end up with 2 pounds of compost being mixed in with that 20 gallons, and then you're applying 2 pounds per acre. Now, you may need to apply more to that, according to David Johnson, depending on the quality and quality of the compost and soil conditions and so on. But what they're finding, and this is another interesting aspect of the whole creating a more fungal compost and using it as extract, that, in one experiment where they were doing corn, and this was extract, so it was applied in furrow at the time of planting, that with the compost extract, they were $86 per acre more profitable over corn that had 256 pounds per acre of nitrogen applied. And so even though the yield was 2% less for the compost extract, the net was an $86 per acre more profitable for the compost extract. So when you hear results like that, and then for example, we were looking at some videos of the young red Angus farm that showed dramatic improvement. So there's a conventional farmer who's changing over to more organic methods, I guess I'll say. Dramatic improvement in emergence, root growth, and he's seeing that currently 50% reduction in nitrogen requirements gives him, along with compost extract, is giving him the best results. So we're looking at creating 2 different types of composting piles that hopefully will be much more fungal dominant, and we'll do some testing on that, and I'll talk about that more later. But I just want to end by saying this whole area of composting and producing highly fungal compost and using that highly fungal compost as an extract at time of planting, and also it can be applied as a foliar, although they're not seeing the kind of benefits, notable benefits applied as a foliar. I'll talk about that more later too, but it's all still in its infancy, and it's currently not known, what microbes are particularly important, or if that changes depending on soil conditions and the plant itself and so on. So yeah, I think I'll wrap it up there, and we'll do some more videos later.